The letter sat unopened on the desk for 3 days, sealed with a wax crest that had not been used since the old Duke's coronation portrait was painted. Eleanor Whitmore knew, before she broke that seal, that it would not contain forgiveness. She knew it the way one knows a storm has arrived before the first drop of rain touches the glass.
This is an insult, Eleanor.
By the stillness
Think of your position.
before it, the held breath of a house, waiting to see what its mistress will do. When at last she lifted the paper and read her uncle's hand, the words were fewer than she expected, and colder. "You have shamed this family before all of England," the Duke of Ravensworth had written. "As is my duty, I shall not leave you destitute. I give you Fenmore, and everything that comes with it. Do with it as you please. I expect never to hear the name Whitmore spoken in my house again." Fenmore, even the servants who had never seen it flinched at the word. It was the property no steward wanted to manage, the estate no tenant wished to farm, the joke told quietly at dinner parties when someone's fortunes had turned poor. Well, at least he's not been sent to Fenmore. A waterlogged stretch of Norfolk marshland, with a crumbling manor house at its heart, inherited by the Ravensworth line 100 years earlier, and never once improved, never once loved. It had passed from disfavoured relative to disfavoured relative, like a curse handed down through generations, always given to whichever family member had most displeased the current Duke. Eleanor understood, reading the letter a second time by candlelight, exactly what her uncle intended. He could not disown her outright. The family's reputation would not survive it, not after the scandal she had already caused. But he could bury her somewhere no one would ever think to look. Somewhere she would fail quietly, far from London, far from the eyes that might otherwise pity her. She did not know then that the very ground he meant to punish her with held a secret that would one day make her the wealthiest woman in 3 counties. She did not know that the marsh he called worthless had already made and unmade a woman's life once before, decades earlier, and that the truth of what had been buried there, quite literally, was more dangerous than any scandal she had yet survived. She did not know that the crumbling manor waiting for her held a locked room no one in the family had opened in a generation, nor that behind that door lay the handwriting of a woman whose name had been quietly scrubbed from every family tree in the house, as though she had never existed at all. All she knew, folding the letter and setting it beside the cold teacup she had forgotten to drink, was that she had exactly one choice left to her: go, or become a beggar in a city that had already decided her fate. Outside her window, rain had begun to fall against the tall panes of Ravensworth Hall, the same rain, she would later learn, that fell almost without ceasing over the fens of Norfolk. As though the sky itself understood what waited for her there, she sat a long while in the near dark, the candle guttering low, turning the letter over in her hands as if some kinder message might reveal itself on its reverse side. None came. There was only her uncle's seal, pressed into wax, the colour of dried blood, and the terrible, quiet finality of a decision already made for her. She chose to go, because there was, in truth, no other choice left to choose. To understand how Eleanor Whitmore came to hold a letter of banishment in her trembling hands, one must go back 11 months, to the night of her own betrothal ball, the night the whole of fashionable society watched her refuse, before 300 witnesses, to marry the man her uncle had chosen for her. She had been raised at Ravensworth Hall since the age of 9, when her parents died within a single winter of one another, her father of a fever that swept through the county, her mother, some whispered of grief that followed so closely behind it, could hardly be called a separate illness at all. The Duke, her father's elder brother, had taken her in, not from affection, but from obligation, the same iron sense of duty that governed every decision he made. She grew up in the shadow of Ravensworth's East Wing, educated alongside her cousins, but never quite one of them, dressed well, but never fashionably, loved by the servants, but tolerated, at best, by the family. She learned early that a girl without a fortune of her own was a guest in her own home, however many years she had slept beneath its roof. By 19 she had become, by every account, a young woman of quiet intelligence and considerable grace. The kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, in the steadiness of her gaze rather than the brightness of her smile. She read more than young ladies were encouraged to read, borrowing volumes on geology and natural history from the estate's neglected library when no one was watching, drawn to subjects she could not have explained even to herself. She asked questions that made dinner guests uncomfortable, about tenant conditions, about drainage schemes, about the odd, half-forgotten corners of the estate no one else troubled to think of at all. The Duchess, before her death some years earlier, had once remarked, not unkindly, that Eleanor had the mind of a land agent trapped in the body of a debutante, and the observation had followed her ever since, whispered behind fans at parties where she was tolerated more than welcomed. And she had, without ever intending to, fallen in love with a man entirely unsuitable to her station, Thomas Ferris, a land agent's son who had grown up managing the estate's outer farms, and who spoke to her, always, as though her opinions mattered as much as her face. He was the only person at Ravensworth who asked what she thought of a thing before telling her what she ought to think of it. And in a household built entirely on hierarchy and obligation, that small, ordinary kindness had come to mean more to her than she dared admit, even to Hannah. Her uncle had other plans. Lord Sedgwick, twice widowed and nearly 40, held vast holdings in Yorkshire and a seat in Parliament the Duke wished to secure an alliance with. The match was arranged with the efficiency of a business transaction, because to the Duke, it was one. Eleanor was informed of her engagement 3 days before it was announced in the papers. She endured the engagement for 4 months in silence, telling herself that duty was its own kind of dignity, that perhaps in time she might learn to be content. But on the night of the ball, meant to formalize the match before the assembled families of both houses, standing before Lord Sedgwick as he prepared to make his declaration to the room, something in her refused to bend any further. She did not shout. She did not weep. She simply said, in a voice that carried further than she intended, that she could not marry a man she did not love, and that she would not spend the rest of her life performing a happiness she did not feel for the comfort of others. The silence that followed was the kind that ends careers, ends reputations, ends the futures of young women who have nowhere else to go. Lord Sedgwick left within the hour. The Duke did not speak to her again that night, nor for many nights after. What followed was not merely disappointment, but the particular, cold fury of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of his peers. And a man, like the Duke of Ravensworth, did not forgive being made a spectacle of. For 11 months, she lived at Ravensworth as a ghost in her own home, spoken to only when necessary, seated at the far end of the table, excluded from every invitation that might have restored her standing. She did not know then that her uncle had spent those same 11 months deciding exactly how to be rid of her without the world accusing him of cruelty. Fenmore was his answer. A gift. On paper. A sentence. In truth. She travelled to Norfolk in early autumn, accompanied only by Hannah, the maid who had served her since childhood and who had refused, quietly and absolutely, to be left behind. The journey took the better part of 2 days, the roads growing narrower and rougher the further east they travelled, the fine coaching inns of the first day giving way, by the second, to little more than farmhouses that let rooms to weary travellers. The land itself seemed to change beneath the carriage wheels, the neat hedgerows of the shires flattening slowly into something wilder, wetter, a horizon broken only by the black silhouettes of windmills turning against a colourless sky. At last the carriage turned down a lane so overgrown that branches scraped against both windows at once, and when Fenmore finally came into view through the mist, Eleanor understood at once why no one who could avoid it ever chose to live there. The manor house crouched at the edge of the marsh, like something the land had tried and failed to swallow. Its roofline sagged in the middle, its chimneys leaned at angles that seemed to defy any law of architecture, and ivy had crept so far across its southern face that whole windows had vanished entirely beneath the growth. Half its remaining windows were boarded, the other half fogged with decades of grime, so that the house seemed to watch her arrival through half-closed, clouded eyes. The gardens, what remained of them, had long since surrendered to reeds and standing water, broken statuary rising here and there from the undergrowth like the last teeth in an old man's mouth. Beyond it all stretched the fen itself, flat and silver-grey to the horizon, and the smell that rose from it, peat and stagnant water, and something faintly metallic beneath it. Clung to the back of the throat and did not leave, Eleanor would discover, for many months. A single elderly caretaker, a man named Bartholomew Rigg, who had kept the house from collapsing entirely out of some private loyalty no one had ever paid him to maintain, met them at the door with an expression that suggested he did not expect them to stay the week. He was a spare, weathered man with a way of looking at Eleanor as though he were measuring her against some private memory only he possessed, though it would be many months before she understood what, or rather who, that memory belonged to. She did not know then that Bartholomew Rigg had watched 3 other Whitmores arrive at Fenmore in disgrace over the course of his lifetime, and that he had buried, in his own quiet way, the memory of the one who had come closest to understanding what the land was truly worth. The first weeks were a lesson in humility that no finishing school could have taught her. The roof leaked in 11 places, and after the first great storm swept in off the coast, Eleanor spent an entire night moving basins and buckets from room to room by candlelight, listening to the house groan around her like some vast, dying creature. The chimneys smoked. The well water ran brown for the first month before it cleared. Eleanor, who had never in her life laid a fire or mended a garment, learned to do both out of necessity, her hands blistering and then, slowly, hardening into something she almost did not recognize as her own. There were nights, in those early weeks, when she sat alone by whatever small fire she had managed to coax to life, and allowed herself, briefly, to weep, not from self-pity. She told herself, but from sheer exhaustion, before wiping her face, straightening her spine, and rising to face the next day's small catastrophe. Hannah managed what she could of the household with a grim, practical cheer that Eleanor suspected was as much for her own benefit as her mistress's, the two of them falling into an easy partnership neither had known at Ravensworth, where the strict lines between lady and servant had never once permitted such closeness. Tenant farmers on the estate's dry margins, there were perhaps a dozen families still scraping a living from the driest edges of Fenmore's land, regarded their new landlady with polite suspicion, having seen enough disgraced relations pass through to know better than to hope this one would be different. They had watched the fen swallow ambitions before. They saw no reason it would spare hers. It would have been easy, in those first months, to simply survive, to let the house crumble a little further each year, to collect what meagre rents the land offered, and to fade quietly into the obscurity her uncle had designed for her. Many women in her position would have done exactly that. But Eleanor had inherited, whether she wished to or not, a particular stubbornness that ran through the Whitmore line like a fault line beneath a hillside, and one wet October afternoon, searching for dry firewood in a part of the house she had not yet explored, she found the locked door at the end of the east corridor. It was not locked with any great ceremony, merely an old iron bolt, rusted nearly solid. That took Bartholomew Rigg the better part of an hour to force open. Behind it lay a small study, untouched, by the look of the dust, for a generation at least, a writing desk, a cold, empty grate, and on a shelf above it, wrapped in oilcloth to keep off the damp, a stack of leather journals belonging to a woman named Lady Rosalind Whitmore, Eleanor's own great-great-aunt, and, as she would soon discover, the last person to hold Fenmore before it became a punishment passed from hand to hand. She did not know then that the journals in her lap would rewrite everything she believed about the marsh beneath her feet. Eleanor sat on the cold floor of that abandoned study long after Bartholomew had gone to see to the fire elsewhere in the house. The oilcloth-wrapped journals spread around her like the pieces of a puzzle she had not yet realized she was assembling. Dust rose from every page she turned, catching the last grey light through the one unboarded window, and there was something in the silence of that room. A silence that felt not empty, but held, as though the house itself had been waiting a very long time for someone to open that door, that made her lower her voice to nothing more than a whisper when she read aloud the first lines to Hannah, who had crept in behind her, curious despite herself. The first journal was dated 1798, nearly 70 years earlier, and it was, at first, an ordinary record of an unhappy woman's days. The weather, small domestic frustrations, a longing for London society she had been exiled from in circumstances the journal did not yet explain. But as Eleanor read further into the winter of that year, the entries changed in tone. Lady Rosalind had begun walking the marsh each morning, cataloguing it with a naturalist's careful eye, filling page after page with sketches of reeds and waterfowl and the particular quality of the fen's light at dawn. And somewhere in that walking she had noticed something that no one before her had thought to look for. A particular blue-grey clay, fine-grained and strangely pure, exposed along the cut banks where the fen's slow-moving water had worn the peat away. She had, Eleanor read with a small, private smile, described it first not as a fortune, but as beautiful, the way it caught the light like slate, the way it held its shape when pressed between two fingers, unlike any soil she had encountered in her studies. No one in the household, then or since, had ever thought to ask why the last woman to truly live at Fenmore had spent her mornings walking the marsh alone with a notebook in hand. It had simply been remembered, when it was remembered at all, as one more strange habit of a strange woman, evidence, if any had been needed, that isolation had unsettled her mind. Eleanor would soon learn how convenient that story had been for the people who told it. Rosalind had written to a chemist of her acquaintance in London, describing the clay in careful detail, and his reply, folded and pressed between the journal's pages, ink faded nearly to nothing, confirmed what she had suspected. The clay was of exceptional quality, comparable, the chemist wrote, to the finest deposits then being used by the great porcelain manufactories of Staffordshire. Properly surveyed and worked, such a deposit could be worth more than the entire remainder of the estate combined. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands unsteady, before she understood the shape of what had happened next. Rosalind had commissioned a formal survey. The surveyor's report, also preserved among the papers, confirmed the clay bed ran wide and deep beneath a significant portion of Fenmore's marshland, a discovery that should have transformed a punishment into a fortune. But something had gone wrong. The journal entries after the survey grew shorter, more guarded, and then, abruptly, mid-sentence, in the spring of 1799, they stopped altogether. The remaining pages of that journal, and every journal after it, were blank. She did not know then that the silence in those pages was not an accident of a woman who had simply stopped writing, but the silence of a woman who had been stopped. It took Eleanor the better part of 2 months, and no small amount of quiet persistence with Bartholomew Rigg, to piece together what had truly happened to Rosalind Whitmore. At first the old man deflected her questions, offering only vague, uneasy answers, and Eleanor began to suspect that his reluctance sprang from something more than an old servant's natural discretion. She did not press him directly. Instead, she brought him tea in the evenings, asked after his health, listened to his stories of the fen's wildlife and weather, without once steering the conversation toward Rosalind, until, slowly, the old man's guardedness began to soften of its own accord. the way frost gives way not to force, but simply to the patient passing of time. It was on a bitter evening in late November, the wind howling low across the marsh outside, that Bartholomew finally spoke of what his own father had told him. The old caretaker's father had served as steward at Fenmore in those years, and though Bartholomew had been only a boy at the time, he remembered fragments, a great argument in the house one autumn night. Voices raised behind a closed door he had not been permitted to enter, his own father sent at dawn the following morning to fetch the Duke of that era from Ravensworth Hall in evident haste, and Lady Rosalind, within the month, quietly removed from Fenmore altogether and installed instead in a small cottage on the estate's furthest, dampest corner, where she lived out the remaining 30 years of her life, and was, by the time Bartholomew was old enough to understand such things, spoken of by the family as a woman whose mind had simply given way to the loneliness of the marsh. But her mind, Eleanor came to believe, had given way to nothing at all. The truth, buried deeper still in a small tin box Bartholomew finally admitted his father had asked him to keep and never open, told a different story. Inside were 3 letters, never sent, drafted in Rosalind's own hand and addressed to a solicitor in Norwich. In them, she begged for help, proving what she had discovered, that her own brother, the Duke of that generation, had learned of the clay bed's value from her survey and, rather than allow an unmarried woman to control such a fortune independently, had quietly arranged to have her judged unfit to manage her own affairs. A single sympathetic physician's signature, a private hearing she was never permitted to attend, and the matter was settled. Fenmore's ownership reverted formally to the Ravensworth title. Rosalind was left with nothing but her small cottage and a family story, repeated for 2 generations afterward, that painted her as an eccentric who had lost herself to isolation. No one in the household, then or now, had ever known the true reason the marsh was called cursed. It was not the damp, nor the fog, nor the difficulty of the land. It was that a woman had found something extraordinary within it and been destroyed for finding it. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for a long while, the cold study around her, rain ticking steadily against the one unboarded window. She thought of her uncle's letter, "You have shamed this family," and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had not been given Fenmore as an afterthought. She had been given it because, in some distant, half-remembered way, it was still considered a place where troublesome women were sent to be forgotten. The Duke likely did not know the specifics of what lay beneath the marsh, that knowledge had been buried along with Rosalind's ruin, deliberately, so thoroughly, that even the family itself no longer remembered why the land was avoided. But the pattern was unmistakable to her now, and she felt, for the first time since her arrival, something other than despair. She felt purpose. She would not make the same mistake Rosalind had made. She would not write to a single solicitor and wait, unprotected, for the family to close ranks around her. She would move carefully, and she would move first. The winter that followed was the hardest of Eleanor's life, and also, though she could not have known it then, the making of her. She wrote, under a name that was not entirely her own, a small caution she had learned from Rosalind's fate, to a mineralogist in London who had once lectured on clay deposits and their industrial uses, describing what she had found without revealing precisely where. His reply was cautiously encouraging. She wrote next to a solicitor, a younger man named Mr. Aldous Crane, recommended to her by a former Ravensworth housekeeper who had married into a Norwich family and who, crucially, owed no loyalty whatsoever to the Duke. Crane was ambitious, sharp, and, most importantly, entirely willing to represent a woman's interests against a title, provided he believed the case sound. Slowly, quietly, through the coldest months of the year, Eleanor built what her great-great-aunt never had the chance to build, a foundation that could not be so easily dismantled. She had Bartholomew, and 2 of the estate's remaining tenant farmers, men named Silas and Croft, who had grown fond of their unexpected new landlady over the autumn's small kindnesses. Help her take fresh samples from the same cut banks Rosalind had once described. She had those samples sent discreetly to 2 separate chemists in 2 separate cities, so that no single report could later be dismissed as an anomaly or a forgery. And she had Mr. Crane draw up, with meticulous care, a full accounting of the estate's ownership history, a paper trail that would, if it ever needed to be produced, make plain exactly how Fenmore had come to be devalued and why. She did not know then how soon she would need every piece of that foundation. Word travels slowly through the fens, but not so slowly that it never arrives at all, and by early spring, whispers had begun reaching Ravensworth Hall that the disgraced niece exiled to Fenmore was not, in fact, wasting away as expected. She was seen in Norwich with a solicitor. Samples of estate soil, of all things, had been sent by post to London on 2 occasions. The Duke's heir apparent, his nephew and presumptive successor, a cold, calculating man named Gerald Ashby, who stood to inherit the dukedom itself one day, and who had long resented the possibility that any Whitmore property might slip from the family's tightest control, took a particular and unpleasant interest in these rumours. It was Gerald who arrived at Fenmore, unannounced on a grey April morning, ostensibly to inquire after his cousin's welfare on the Duke's behalf, though Eleanor understood within the first 5 minutes of his visit that welfare had nothing whatsoever to do with it. He arrived in a fine carriage, entirely unsuited to the rutted lane, and stepped down from it with the particular distaste of a man who considered even the mud beneath his boots a personal insult. He complimented her, with obvious insincerity, on how well she had managed to keep the old house standing, and asked, with a casualness she did not for one moment believe, whether the marsh air had been agreeable to her health. Then he walked the edge of the marsh with an interest too precise to be casual, pausing at the very cut bank where the clay lay closest to the surface, though Eleanor had said nothing to direct him there. He asked pointed questions about the samples she had sent to London, phrased carefully enough that a less watchful woman might have mistaken them for idle curiosity. She answered him with equal care, revealing nothing, though she felt, watching him crouch at the water's edge and turn a lump of the blue-grey clay over in his gloved fingers, the particular chill of being seen through by someone who wished her nothing but harm. He left, after barely an hour, with the thin, satisfied smile of a man who believed he had confirmed a suspicion. She did not know then exactly what Gerald Ashby intended, only that his visit had cost her the small safety of secrecy. What she would learn, in the weeks that followed, was that he intended to do to her precisely what his ancestor had done to Rosalind, only faster, and with the modern tools of a modern age. Gerald began, quietly, to make inquiries of his own solicitor about the legal standing of Fenmore's title, searching for any clause, any technicality, by which the estate might be reclaimed by the main Ravensworth line before Eleanor could establish a claim to whatever lay beneath it. He also began spreading, through careful and deniable channels, renewed rumours in the local villages that the new mistress of Fenmore was troubled in her mind, unstable, prone to wild fancies, the exact accusation, though Eleanor did not yet know it, that had been used against Rosalind 70 years before. Tenant families who had begun, cautiously, to trust her grew wary again. Silas, frightened for his family's tenancy, stopped meeting her eye. A letter arrived from her uncle himself, the first since her banishment, containing no warmth but a great deal of thinly veiled threat. Reports had reached him, he wrote, of unbecoming conduct, of a niece embarrassing the family yet again with foolish schemes about mud and minerals, and he wished to remind her that her position, however generously granted, could be reconsidered. For the first time since finding Rosalind's journals, Eleanor felt the old fear return, the fear of a young woman without a title, without a fortune, without a single man in her family willing to stand beside her, facing down the machinery of an entire aristocratic house. She thought, in her darkest hour that spring, of simply letting it go, of writing to her uncle, apologizing, asking to be allowed back into the smallest corner of his forgiveness. It would have been so much easier. She did not know then that Bartholomew Rigg had one final piece of the truth he had not yet told her, the reason his father had never destroyed Rosalind's letters, the reason he himself had kept them hidden for 40 years rather than burning them as instructed. It was guilt. His father, on his deathbed, had confessed that he had known, all those years ago, precisely what had been done to Lady Rosalind, and had done nothing to stop it, because he feared for his own family's position. Bartholomew had carried that inherited shame his entire life, and when he finally told Eleanor the whole of it, weeping in a way she had never seen the old man weep, he gave her something Gerald Ashby did not know she possessed, his own sworn willingness to testify, if it ever came to it, to everything his father had told him. It was that testimony, added to Mr. Crane's careful documents and the mineralogist's independent reports, that gave Eleanor the courage to do what Rosalind never had the chance to do. She did not wait for Gerald Ashby to strike first. She went to him. She travelled to Ravensworth Hall in May, uninvited, and requested, not asked. Requested, in a tone she had not known she possessed until she heard herself use it, an audience with her uncle and his nephew together. The Duke, curious despite himself, and perhaps unwilling to refuse a meeting that might finally settle the embarrassment of her permanently, agreed. She stood before them, both in the same drawing-room where, 11 months earlier, she had refused Lord Sedgwick before 300 witnesses, and she was struck, standing there again, by how little the room itself had changed, and how entirely she had. The same portraits looked down from the same walls, generations of Ravensworth dukes and duchesses, painted in the same stern, unyielding poses. As though the family had agreed, long before she was born, on precisely how dignity ought to look. This time there was no audience but the two men who held, or believed they held, absolute power over her future, and she found, standing before them, that the fear which had once made her voice shake before 300 strangers had somehow, over a long winter of blistered hands and cold nights, burned itself away entirely. She laid before them the mineralogist's reports, one from London and one from Sheffield, each arriving independently at the same conclusion. She laid before them Mr. Crane's ownership history, tracing the Claybed's discovery back 70 years to Rosalind Whitmore, and the quiet, deliberate cruelty by which that discovery had been erased from family memory. The physician's signature obtained without proper examination, the private hearing Rosalind had never been permitted to attend, the cottage she had been quietly installed in for the remainder of her life. She watched her uncle's face as she spoke, and saw for the first time in the 11 years she had lived under his roof, something in his composure genuinely falter, and she told them, in a voice that did not shake, that she intended to develop the deposit herself, under her own name, with her own solicitor, and that any attempt to seize the land from her, as had been attempted once before, and as she now had every reason to believe Gerald was attempting again, would be met with the full weight of documentation and testimony she had spent the winter assembling, including Bartholomew Rigg's own sworn account of what his father had confessed to him, presented not privately to the family, but publicly, to whatever court or newspaper proved necessary. The Duke of Ravensworth did not speak for a long moment. Eleanor watched something move behind his eyes that she had never seen there before. Not affection, not yet, but something closer to reassessment, the particular unsettling of a man realizing he has fundamentally misjudged another person's measure. Gerald, less composed, blustered about forgeries and hysteria, the very words his ancestor had once used against Rosalind, until the Duke, quietly and without raising his voice, told him to be silent. What the Duke said next, Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Though it was not, in the end, an apology. It was simply this, that he had not known about the clay, that he had not known about his own great-aunt's fate, and that whatever else he believed about Eleanor's conduct the previous year, he was not a man who would knowingly stand between a legitimate discovery and the woman who had earned it through her own labour. He gave her, that afternoon, his written word that Fenmore's title and everything beneath it belonged to her, unconditionally, and that any interference from Gerald or any other member of the family would be dealt with as a matter of family discipline. It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. But it was, Eleanor understood as she rode back toward Fenmore that evening, something more valuable than either. It was recognition, wrung from a man who had never once been made to give it freely. The months that followed tested her in different ways entirely. Building an industry from a marsh, she discovered, required a different kind of courage than surviving disgrace. The courage to be wrong in front of skeptical men, to spend money she did not yet have on the belief that it would return tenfold, to hold her ground when the first drainage attempts failed and the local paper printed a small, mocking item about the Fen's newest fool who fancied herself a mining engineer. There were nights that summer when she stood at the edge of the flooded cutting, watching weeks of labour sink back into the mud, and wondered whether she had simply exchanged one kind of ruin for another. But she thought, on those nights, of Rosalind's careful sketches, of the patient, methodical hand that had catalogued a marsh no one else had thought worth looking at twice, and she found, each time, the will to begin again the following morning. She partnered, on Mr. Crane's careful advice, with a Staffordshire manufactory, willing to take on the risk of developing the clay in exchange for a fair share of its profits, a deal she negotiated herself, across a table of men who had never once negotiated with a woman as an equal, and who left that meeting, several of them later admitted, considerably humbled by how thoroughly she had understood her own figures. She learned, that year, to read a balance sheet as fluently as she had once read novels, to speak the language of drainage engineers and clay assayers, to stand in rooms full of men twice her age and hold her ground without raising her voice, having learned from bitter experience that a raised voice was so often mistaken for hysteria, while a steady one could not be so easily dismissed. Silas and Croft, once wary, became her staunchest allies once the first wagon loads of clay proved as fine as the chemists had promised. And word spread through the tenant families that steady work, real, well-paid work, draining and digging and hauling, was finally coming to Fenmore after generations of neglect. Bartholomew Rigg, in his final years, lived to see the marsh he had tended out of stubborn loyalty transformed into something that drew engineers and investors down that same overgrown lane his father had once ridden in disgrace and secrecy. And Eleanor, in a small ceremony she insisted upon herself, had a modest stone marker placed near the old cut bank where Rosalind's journals said the discovery had first been made, engraved simply with her great-great-aunt's name and the words, "She saw its worth first." By the following autumn, precisely 1 year after she had arrived at Fenmore with nothing but a maid, a trunk, and a letter of banishment, the estate that had once been the family's private joke had become the most discussed property in 3 counties, not for its poverty, but for the extraordinary fortune rising from its soil. The Duke, whatever pride kept him from saying so aloud, was seen more than once, quietly inquiring after his niece's progress at his club, and when Gerald Ashby's own finances suffered a very public embarrassment the following spring, few in society failed to notice which cousin's star was rising and which was falling. Eleanor did not marry Lord Sedgwick, nor any man chosen for her by anyone else's calculation. She wrote, eventually, to Thomas Ferris, no longer a land agent's son, but a man of some standing himself, having taken on the management of Fenmore's expanding works at her own invitation, and what grew between them grew slowly, on terms she alone set, In a partnership, neither duty nor punishment had any part in shaping. He never once asked her to be smaller than she had become, and she found, in that simple absence of expectation, a kind of tenderness she had not known she was permitted to want. Hannah stayed on as more companion than servant by then, her fierce loyalty of that first terrible autumn having grown, over the years, into something closer to family. Bartholomew Rigg lived to see 2 full seasons of the works before he passed quietly in his sleep one winter, and Eleanor buried him not in the servants' corner of the churchyard, but beside the small stone she had raised for Rosalind, saying only that the 2 of them had waited long enough, separately, to finally rest together. She did not know, on that first grey afternoon, when she read her uncle's letter and believed her life had ended, that Fenmore would become not her punishment, but her proof, that the very ground chosen to humble her would instead become the foundation upon which she built a life entirely her own, answering to no one's expectations, but the quiet, patient truth she had learned from a dead woman's hidden journals, that worth, once buried, does not disappear. It waits, in the dark and the damp and the years of neglect, for someone patient enough and brave enough to dig it back into the light. Years later, when young women of her acquaintance asked how she had endured that first terrible winter in the marsh, not knowing yet what lay beneath her feet, Eleanor would tell them only this, that she had never once believed the land was worthless. She had simply been the first person in 70 years willing to ask why everyone else believed it was. If this story moved you, stay a while longer in the world of forgotten fortunes and quiet reckonings. Follow this channel so the next tale finds you when it's ready to be told.